I was one lock away from freedom when he walked in. The sign on the door already said, "Closed." The espresso machine hissed its final sigh, and I was counting the till with the slow satisfaction of someone who'd survived another endless day of polite smiles and lukewarm cappuccinos. The cafe was empty, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of the rain against the windows. Soft and steady. The kind of rain that makes the world feel like it's dissolving at the edges. I had just slid the deadbolt halfway when the door creaked open, the bell chiming with a sound far too delicate for the man who filled the doorway. He didn't belong there. He didn't belong anywhere ordinary. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a tailored charcoal coat, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain, and his gaze. His gaze was the kind that didn't simply look at you. It entered you, quietly, deliberately, as if searching for something only he knew existed. His presence swallowed the room in silence so complete that even the rain seemed to hesitate. "I'm sorry," I said, already flustered, my voice cracking under the weight of his stare. "We're closed." He paused, glancing at the chalkboard menu as though he had all the time in the world, then met my eyes again with an expression that made my pulse stutter. His voice was deep, smooth like smoke curling around a secret. "One last coffee," he said. It wasn't a question. For reasons I couldn't explain, not then, not even now, I nodded. Maybe it was the way he said it, soft but commanding, or maybe it was the exhaustion that made me careless. But I found myself turning back toward the espresso machine, pretending I didn't feel the weight of his eyes on me as I worked. The hiss of steam filled the air. My hands trembled slightly as I tamped the grounds, the metallic scent of coffee mingling with the faint musk of his cologne. Wood, smoke, and something darker. When I set the cup down in front of him, he didn't drink right away. He just stared at it for a long time. The way someone might look at an old photograph, his fingers tracing the rim as if he were remembering something. Then, without a word, he looked up at me. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena," I said instinctively. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, as though committing it to memory. "Lena," he repeated, and when he said it, it sounded like more than a name, like a secret being unwrapped. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving mine, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke. There was something unsettling in that silence, a strange familiarity, like déjà vu wrapped in danger. I didn't know him. I was certain of that. But somehow, deep in my bones, I felt as if I should. "You always work this late?" he asked, his tone almost casual, though his gaze was anything but. "Someone has to keep this place from falling apart," I replied, forcing a small smile. "It's just me most. Nights." He tilted his head slightly as though considering that. "That's dangerous." I laughed, too quickly, too nervously. "It's a coffee shop, not a war zone." He smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile that softened him. It was the kind that warned you not to mistake him for someone kind. "You'd be surprised," he murmured. Something in his voice made the back of my neck prickle. I looked down, pretending to wipe the counter, trying to shake off the strange, magnetic tension wrapping itself around us. When I glanced up again, he was holding out a $100 bill. "That's too much," I said automatically. "I'm not paying for the coffee." "Then what?" "For your time." His interruption was quiet. Smooth, but it cut through me all the same. I stared at him, unsure if I should be insulted, afraid, or intrigued. "You don't even know me," I said finally. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the counter, his voice lowering until it was a whisper meant only for me. "That's where you're wrong, Lena." My blood turned to ice. He said my name again, but this time it wasn't casual. It wasn't conversational. It was heavy, like he'd been carrying it for a long time. "How do you know my name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was hammering so hard I thought he might hear it. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past me, through the window, where the rain had thickened into a silver curtain, then back at me with a gaze so sharp it felt like a blade sliding just beneath my skin. "You should lock that door," he said softly. I frowned. "Why?" "Because they'll be here soon." The words hit me like a cold slap. I laughed nervously, waiting for him to smirk, to reveal the joke, but he didn't. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't look away. "I think you should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, low and almost regretful, and then stood. When he reached into his coat, I flinched, but all he pulled out was a black leather wallet. He placed a small card on the counter, his movements deliberate, precise. "If anyone asks for you," he said, "you call this number and say nothing else. Do you understand?" My hand shook as I looked down at the card. No name, no company, just a number embossed in silver. "This isn't funny," I said, stepping back. He looked at me for a long moment, and then his expression softened, just barely, like a man haunted by something he couldn't name. "It's not meant to be." And then, as if remembering something, he leaned closer again, his voice dropping to a whisper so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. "Your father used to make his coffee the same way," he said. I froze. The name caught in my throat before I could stop it. "My father?" But before I could say anything else, he was gone. Out the door. Into the rain. Swallowed by the night as if he'd never been there at all. I stood there, my breath shallow, my pulse wild, the bell above the door still trembling from his exit. The smell of coffee hung in the air like a memory that refused to fade. I reached for the card, my fingers brushing against the embossed number, and noticed for the first time the faint smudge of blood on the edge of the counter where he'd been sitting. Outside, through the rain, headlights flashed once, twice, and then disappeared down the street. For a moment I thought about calling the police, but then I looked again at the card, at the number that felt like a key I wasn't supposed to have, and something deep inside me whispered that this was only the beginning, and that whoever he wasn't done with me yet. I didn't sleep that night. I tried, God, I tried, but every time I closed my eyes I saw his face, the sharp lines of his jaw, the cool glint of his eyes under the low cafe lights, and that terrible, impossible moment when he said my father's name like it was something sacred, something broken, something buried that should have stayed buried. The sound of his voice lingered long after he left, curling around me like smoke, seeping under my skin until I could almost taste it, bitter and intoxicating all at once. By the time dawn came, the rain had stopped, but the city still felt damp and heavy, the streets shining under the weak light like veins of glass. I told myself I was being paranoid, that men like him belonged in movies, not in my cafe, not in my life. And yet, the card sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded gun, small and silent and impossible to ignore. I picked it up more times than I could count, my thumb running over the raised silver numbers, memorizing them even though I swore I wouldn't. I told myself I'd throw it away, burn it, pretend none of it happened. But something in me resisted, something I couldn't name, something that whispered, "Don't." By the time I went to open the cafe that morning, my nerves were shot. The bell over the door chimed in that same delicate way, and I flinched, half expecting him to be there again, sitting at his table like some dark echo of the night before. But the place was empty, still smelling faintly of rain and roasted beans, and for a moment I almost convinced myself I had dreamed the whole thing. Almost. because when I stepped behind the counter, I saw it. A faint trace of blood still smeared on the corner where his hand had rested. Proof that he had been real, that I hadn't imagined the quiet authority in his voice or the strange, heavy way he'd said my name. I stared at it for too long, until a customer came in and startled me out of whatever trance I was in. The day passed in a blur of ordinary moments that felt painfully unreal. People laughing, chatting, ordering their lattes and mochas, while I smiled and nodded and pretended not to feel like the ground beneath me had shifted. Every time the door opened, my heart leapt, expecting him, dreading him, wanting him, and hating myself for it. It was just after closing that it happened again. The cafe was quiet, the sun low, painting the windows in warm gold, and I was cleaning the espresso machine when I felt it. That same electric hum in the air, that instinctive tightening in my chest that told me I wasn't alone. I turned, slowly, and there he was. Dante. I didn't know his name yet. Not then. But somehow it fit him even before I heard it. Sharp, deliberate, dangerous, the kind of name that cuts when spoken aloud. He was sitting at the same table as before, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room, his coat draped over the backrest, a faint smile playing on his lips, as if he'd been waiting for me to notice him. "What are you doing here?" I managed to say, my voice sounding smaller than I intended, though I stood as straight as I could, my hands gripping the counter just to keep them from shaking. "I told you," he said, his tone smooth but threaded with something colder, something that made my stomach twist. "They'd come for you." I blinked, trying to process that. "Who would—" He stood before I could finish, moving with that same unhurried grace, every step controlled, measured. When he reached the counter, he placed something on it. A small black envelope sealed with wax. "Open it," he said. I hesitated, then tore it open, my fingers clumsy. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, of me locking up the cafe 2 nights ago. Another of me walking to my car, and another, worse than the others, of me asleep in my apartment, the glow from the streetlight slicing across my face. My breath caught. "I don't understand." "They were watching you," he said, his voice soft but deadly serious. "They found out who your father was, and they know you're the only piece left to reach him." I felt the room tilt. "My father's been gone for 10 years. He's not dead," he interrupted quietly. I stared at him, unable to speak. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck like a man tired of carrying the weight of too many lies. "He made enemies. He stole from the wrong people. You're the only thing they can use now." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "No, you don't know what you're talking about." He leaned closer, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of rain still clinging to his coat, close enough that his words brushed against my skin. "I know exactly who you are, Lena Moretti." The sound of my full name in his mouth sent a shiver through me. I didn't know if it was fear or something darker, something I didn't want to name. "How?" I whispered. He studied me for a long moment before answering, his eyes searching mine as though deciding how much truth I could handle. "Because I've been looking for you." The words hit harder than I expected, colder too, and before I could ask why, he turned toward the window, his posture shifting, alert. "Get down," he said suddenly, his voice sharp. "What?" He didn't repeat himself. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me down just as glass shattered across the room, the window exploding inward in a rain of shards. The sound was deafening. A gunshot, maybe 2, then silence, heavy and absolute. I was trembling, crouched on the floor beside him, his arm around me, his body a wall of warmth and tension. I could feel his heart pounding hard against my shoulder, his breath steady despite the chaos. "They found you faster than I thought," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. Then he looked at me, his expression unreadable, equal parts fury and something that looked dangerously like regret. "We have to go." What just happened?" I stammered. He stood, pulling me up with him, his hand still gripping mine. "They won't stop, Lena. Not until they get what they came for." "I don't even know who they are." "You don't need to," he said. And when I tried to pull away, he turned, his eyes locking on mine with such intensity it stole my breath. "You can hate me later, but if you want to live, you come with me, now." Outside, tires screeched. Headlights flared through the broken window. Someone shouted. He drew a gun from inside his coat. The motion quick. Practiced. Terrifying. Everything in me screamed to run, but his hand tightened around mine, and before I could decide, before I could even breathe, he was pulling me toward the back door, into the rain, into the darkness that had been waiting all along. And as the night swallowed us whole, I realized one terrible truth. I wasn't running from him. I was running with him. The night was a blur of rain, sirens, and the echo of my heartbeat pounding in my ears like a second storm, wild and relentless. And if I thought I had known fear before, the kind that creeps into your bones when you're walking home alone or when a stranger lingers too long in a dark street, I learned that real fear is different. It's sharp, electric, alive. It's the cold hand that grabs your wrist and drags you through a back door while glass still rains from the ceiling. And yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, I followed him without screaming, without resisting. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the panic, I trusted him, and that terrified me even more than the gunfire. The alley behind the cafe smelled of wet asphalt and smoke, and the rain came down in thin, icy sheets that blurred the world into streaks of shadow and light. Dante's grip on my wrist was unyielding, not cruel but absolute, the way a current grips anything caught in its path. He moved with precision, never hesitating, his gun in one hand, his body shielding mine as though this was routine for him, as though bullets and darkness were as familiar as breathing. "Keep your head down," he said, his voice calm, controlled, too calm for a man who'd just been shot at. I wanted to ask who they were, who wanted me dead, what any of this had to do with my father. But the words tangled in my throat, and all that came out was a strangled whisper. "Where are you taking me?" "To safety," he replied simply. And that word, safety, sounded foreign coming from him, like a language he didn't speak often. He opened the door of a black car waiting in the alley, sleek and humming low, the kind of car that didn't belong in my world of coffee grounds and rent notices. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, the rain slicking my hair to my face, my chest heaving, torn between the instinct to run and the realization that I had nowhere left to go. "Get in, Lena," he said, and when I didn't move fast enough, he looked at me, really looked, and there was something in his eyes then. Not anger, not impatience, but urgency laced with something strangely protective. And before I could think better of it, I slid into the passenger seat. The door shut with a heavy finality, the kind that made me feel like I'd just sealed my fate. We sped off through the maze of city streets, tires slicing through puddles, the world outside flickering past in flashes of neon and shadow. I pressed myself back into the seat, gripping the edge, watching him from the corner of my eye, the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands stayed steady on the wheel, unshaken by the chaos we'd left behind. "Who are you?" I finally asked, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound defiant. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned onto an empty stretch of road that led away from the city, the lights fading behind us until there was only darkness, and the sound of rain drumming against the windshield. Then finally, he spoke. "Dante Romano." The name landed like a spark in my chest, unfamiliar yet heavy with meaning. It was a name I'd heard once, whispered in the kind of stories my father used to tell after too many drinks. Stories about men who ruled the city's shadows, who made deals with blood instead of ink. Romano, I repeated, the realization slowly blooming into something close to dread. As in the Romano Syndicate? He gave a faint, humorless smile. So you have heard of me. Everyone's heard of you, I said, my throat dry. You're not a good man, he finished for me, his tone flat, his eyes fixed on the road. I know. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, filled only by the rhythmic sweep of the wipers and the low hum of the engine. I should have been afraid, truly afraid, sitting in a car with a man whose name was synonymous with power and violence. But there was something else beneath the fear, something harder to admit. Curiosity, fascination, the way danger can draw you in before you even realize you're drowning. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost reluctant. Your father used to work for me. The words hit like a blow. I turned to him sharply, my breath catching. That's not possible. My father was a thief, Dante said evenly, his eyes still on the road. A good one, but reckless. He stole from me, from my family. My stomach turned. You're lying. He glanced at me then, and there was no mockery in his gaze, only something like pity. I wish I were. The rain intensified, hammering against the glass, drowning out the small, desperate sound that escaped my throat. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that my father had been many things, unreliable, absent, a man who lived on debts and half-truths, but not a thief, not someone who would cross a man like Dante Romano. I turned toward the window, my reflection fractured in the wet glass. So what? I said finally, my voice shaking. You're taking me because of him? He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me more than words could. Because of what he took, he said at last, and because now they think you have it. I don't even know what you're talking about, I snapped, anger breaking through the fear at last. I haven't seen my father in years. I don't have anything to do with him or with you. I know, he said quietly, but they don't. The car slowed as we turned off the main road onto a narrow path lined with trees, the branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The house came into view gradually, a sprawling mansion set back from the road, its windows glowing faintly against the dark. The kind of place that looked both beautiful and haunted. My pulse quickened. Where are we? My home, he said. I almost laughed, the absurdity of it, the impossibility. You're taking me to your house? What, am I your hostage now? He parked the car, killed the engine, and turned to face me fully for the first time since we'd left the city. Rain dripped from his hair onto the collar of his shirt, and in the dim light his expression was unreadable. Hard, yes, but not cruel. No, he said softly. You're under my protection. Protection? I echoed, my voice rising. From who? From everyone who wants you dead, he replied, his tone so calm it made me tremble. I stared at him, trying to find some trace of reason, something to hold on to, but all I saw was the quiet certainty of a man who meant every word he said. I don't need your protection, I whispered. I just want to go home. He leaned closer, his gaze steady, unflinching. You don't have a home anymore, Lena. Not until I find out who's coming after you. Not until I know what your father left behind. The air between us was charged, alive, too heavy to breathe. I wanted to scream, to hit him, to demand he let me go. But instead I found myself staring at his mouth, at the faint scar cutting through his lower lip, and wondering what kind of life could carve a man like this from flesh and shadow. He opened his door and stepped out into the rain, coming around to mine, opening it for me like a gentleman in some twisted version of a fairy tale. I hesitated, then followed, the cold hitting me like a wall. The house loomed ahead, vast and silent, the door opening before he even touched it, as though the building itself obeyed him. I stepped inside, my shoes leaving a trail of water on the marble floor, the air thick with the scent of leather, smoke, and rain. His scent. And I realized then, with a cold, crawling certainty, that my life as I'd known it had ended the moment he said one last coffee. And as the door shut behind me with a soft, echoing click, I understood something even worse. That I wasn't sure if he'd kidnapped me or saved me. The house was too quiet for its size, the kind of silence that feels alive, like something breathing just beneath the surface, waiting to reveal its true shape once you've stopped pretending you're not afraid. From the moment I stepped inside, dripping rain onto the marble floors, I felt as though the walls were watching me, tall and dark and lined with oil paintings of men whose eyes followed me wherever I went. Faces that looked like his, proud, unsmiling, carved from the same lineage of power and ruin. The air smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, expensive whiskey and secrets. Somewhere deeper in the house, I could hear the low hum of voices, masculine and sharp, the sound of a world I was not supposed to belong to. Dante walked ahead without looking back, his steps confident, silent, assured. The way predators move when they know the space is theirs, when they know everything inside it bends to their will. I followed because I didn't know what else to do, my pulse echoing in my ears, the sound of my wet shoes against the marble far too loud. "Where are we?" I asked finally, my voice smaller than I intended, swallowed by the vaulted ceilings. "My estate," he said simply, glancing at me over his shoulder. "You'll be safe here." The word safe sounded foreign again, hollow around the edges, like a promise too fragile to believe. He led me through a corridor lit by a line of sconces that cast a soft amber glow against the dark wood, and every door we passed was closed, heavy and secretive, as if the house itself was full of things that shouldn't be seen. We reached a staircase that curved upward like a ribbon of shadow, and at the top, he opened a door and motioned for me to enter. "This will be your room," he said. It was larger than my entire apartment, a canopy bed draped in linen, a fireplace already burning low, casting a flicker of gold across the walls. There were books stacked neatly on the table, a vase of white lilies on the dresser, the scent delicate and mournful. "You'll stay here," he continued. "You'll have food, clothes, anything you need. But you don't leave this floor without me, understand?" I turned toward him, incredulous. "So I'm a prisoner?" His gaze didn't waver. "You're protected. By locking me up. By keeping you alive," he said, and his voice was so calm, so deliberate, that it silenced the argument forming in my throat. He lingered for a moment, his eyes softening just barely, then turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a click that sounded like finality. I stood there for a long time, staring at that closed door, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing until it no longer sounded like my own. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked gardens, the stone statues half hidden in the mist, their faces blank and cold. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps, every gust of wind like a whisper. Somewhere, I thought I heard the faint sound of music. A piano, low and slow, playing a melody that ached with loneliness. When I finally rose, unable to stand the confinement any longer, I crept toward the door. The hallway was dim, lit only by the dying firelight spilling from the room behind me. I knew I shouldn't. He had told me not to. But curiosity, that dangerous human weakness, clawed harder than fear. I moved quietly, my bare feet soundless against the carpeted hall, and followed the faint hum of voices until I reached a staircase leading down. I descended halfway and stopped, peering through the ornate railing at the scene below. Dante was there, sitting at a long table with several men, their faces hard, their words low and clipped. I couldn't hear much, but I caught pieces. The Moretti girl. Unfinished business. The missing ledger. My stomach twisted at the sound of my father's name. One of the men, broad, older, with a scar cutting through his brow, said something that made Dante's expression darken. His hand came down on the table, not loud but sharp enough to end the conversation. The others fell silent immediately. That silence told me everything about the kind of man Dante was. The kind you didn't cross twice. Then, as if he felt me watching, his head tilted upward slightly, his gaze meeting mine through the railing. I froze. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then he stood, pushing back his chair with slow, deliberate precision, and I did the only thing my panic-stricken mind could think of. I ran. By the time I reached my room, my pulse was a hammer in my chest. I shut the door and backed away, breathing hard, my hands trembling. A few seconds later, there was a soft knock. "Lena," he said from the other side, his tone unreadable. "Open the door." I said nothing. Another pause, then quieter, closer. "You shouldn't have left your room." The door opened anyway. He didn't wait for permission, and he stepped inside, his presence filling the space. The tension, thick enough to touch. He wasn't angry in the way I expected. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. Instead, he closed the door behind him, his eyes locked on mine with that unnerving stillness that made him more dangerous than any man I'd ever known. "I told you this house isn't safe for you to wander," he said finally, his voice low, controlled. I took a step back. "I heard my father's name," I said, my words trembling but defiant. "I have a right to know why." He stared at me for a long moment, the silence stretching between us until it became unbearable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair, the tension in his shoulders softening, though his eyes never lost their darkness. "Your father," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care, "was once my most trusted man. He handled things no one else could, until the day he disappeared, with money, documents, and names that were never supposed to leave my house." I shook my head. "He wouldn't—" "He did," Dante said, cutting me off gently. "And because of him, people died." The words hit like a slap, sharp and cold. "You're saying he betrayed you?" His jaw tightened. "He betrayed everyone." I sank onto the edge of the bed, my mind spinning, the weight of his words pressing down until I could hardly breathe. I didn't know what to believe. My father, the man who'd taught me how to make coffee and play cards and vanish when things got bad, or the man standing in front of me, whose voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who had seen the truth written in blood. "Why tell me this?" I whispered. "Because you deserve to know what kind of world you've been dragged into," he said softly. And when I looked up at him, the expression on his face startled me. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, but something almost tender, almost regretful. He took a slow step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint trace of rain still clinging to his skin. "I don't want to hurt you, Lena," he said quietly, "but I can't let you leave until I find what your father took." Our eyes met, and for a long, breathless moment, the world narrowed to that single point. His gaze, my heartbeat. The silence between us heavy with everything unspoken. I should have hated him. I should have screamed. But instead, something inside me twisted, something dangerous and alive. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You're safer here than anywhere else," he said, and his voice was softer now, almost reluctant. "Even if you don't believe it yet." When the door closed behind him, I sat in the flickering light of the fire, staring into the shadows, my thoughts spinning in wild, impossible circles. Because for the first time since he'd dragged me out of that cafe, I realized the truth I hadn't wanted to face. that the danger wasn't just outside this house. It was here, in its walls, in its master. And worse still, it was beginning to live inside me too. It's strange how quickly fear becomes a kind of rhythm, how the first night you lie awake listening for footsteps beyond your door, heart caught in your throat. You tell yourself it's just the wind or the old house shifting, and by the second night you stop pretending and start listening, waiting, expecting it. Because some part of you knows that the moment you hear his footsteps again will be the moment the silence finally stops crushing you. The days inside Dante's house blurred together like spilled ink, bleeding into one another, until I lost count of time. There were no clocks, no sounds from the outside world, no glimpses of the city I used to belong to, only the muffled voices of his men downstairs, the faint creak of doors that never opened for me, and the occasional flicker of his shadow passing the hallway, like the slow movement of a tide that came closer each day. He didn't keep me locked in the room anymore, not exactly. The door was never bolted now, but it didn't need to be, because I'd begun to understand that the boundaries weren't made of locks, but of fear and curiosity, and something darker that tied me to him. It was the third morning when he appeared again. I was sitting by the fire with a book I wasn't really reading, tracing the same line of text over and over when the door opened without warning, and he stepped inside as if he had every right to, his presence as effortless and consuming as ever. He wore black. He always wore black. The kind of black that absorbed light, that made the pale scar above his lip stand out like a story I hadn't yet been told. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze unreadable, then crossed the room and poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter near the window, the amber liquid catching the light before vanishing into the shadows of his hand. "You're awake early," he said. I smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "I don't sleep much anymore. Hard to rest when you're someone's captive." He turned at that, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make my chest tighten. "Captive," he repeated softly, tasting the word like it amused him. "Is that what you think you are?" I looked up at him, meeting his eyes. "What else would you call it?" He took a slow sip, his gaze steady. "Alive," he said simply. The words hit harder than they should have, and I hated that part of me. The part that wanted to believe him, that wanted to imagine that his cruelty had some twisted form of care buried inside it. He set the glass down and walked toward me, stopping just close enough that I could feel the subtle warmth radiating from him, that strange pull that made my pulse race even when my mind screamed to stay still. "You said my father worked for you," I said quietly. "You said he stole something. What exactly did he take?" Dante studied me, his expression unreadable. "Information, money. A ledger that contained names of men who shouldn't exist on paper." "And you think I have it?" He shrugged, a gesture that somehow carried more weight than words. "Someone does. And until I find it, you're leverage." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was the only way to keep my voice from breaking. "So that's it. I'm bait." He didn't deny it. For a long time we stood there in silence, the kind that stretches too thin, too fragile until it starts to hum. Then he said, almost reluctantly, "I don't want to hurt you, Lena. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" I whispered, "because it feels like a punishment I don't deserve." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and took out something, a folded photograph, and handed it to me. It was old, creased at the edges. My father stood beside a younger Dante, both men smiling, glasses in hand, shadows of trust and camaraderie frozen in time. My throat tightened as I stared at it, realizing how little I'd known about the man who raised me, or the world he'd been part of. We were brothers once, Dante said quietly, almost to himself. Not by blood, but by choice. He saved my life once, years ago. I thought I owed him everything, until I learned he'd been selling me piece by piece to my enemies. I looked up at him, the ache in his voice cutting through the layers of control he always carried. And now you want revenge. I want truth, he said, and for the first time his voice cracked ever so slightly. And I want what was taken from me. He turned away then, his hands braced on the mantel, staring into the fire as if it held answers. Help me find him, Lena, he said after a long pause. Help me find what he stole, and when this is over, I'll let you go. There it was. The bargain, simple and cruel, wrapped in the illusion of mercy. I should have refused. I should have told him to burn with his ghosts and his vendettas. But something in me, something I still don't fully understand, made me nod. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was the desperate need to prove that I wasn't my father's shadow. Or maybe it was him. The way his voice softened when he said my name. The way he looked at me like I was the last thing tethering him to what remained of his humanity. Fine, I said at last, my words low. I'll help you. But you keep your promise. When this is over, you let me go. He turned, his eyes meeting mine, dark and unreadable. You have my word. He said it with such quiet certainty that, for a fleeting second, I almost believed him. The days that followed were strange. I was no longer confined, yet I wasn't free. I was allowed to walk through the halls now, to explore the library, to sit in the sunlit conservatory that overlooked the courtyard where the rain always seemed to fall no matter the season. I began to see glimpses of the world beneath his control, men who moved like shadows, women who spoke in whispers, and Dante himself, always at the center, commanding everything with a look, a word, a silence. And in those silences between us, something began to shift. He'd come to my room at night sometimes, not to threaten, not to demand, but simply to talk, as if the weight of his empire could only be carried in the presence of someone who didn't fear him completely. We spoke of small things, coffee, music, the taste of rain, things that didn't belong in a house like his, things that made him seem human, almost tender. And yet beneath it all, there was the ever-present tension, the unspoken truth that none of this could last, that everything between us was born from circumstance and deceit. But when he looked at me across the dim light, eyes softened by exhaustion and something dangerously close to affection, I found myself forgetting, just for a heartbeat, who he was, or who I was supposed to be to him. The night he touched my hand for the first time, it wasn't planned. We were standing by the fire, the silence stretching, his expression unreadable, and when his fingers brushed mine, it was so gentle, so deliberate, that my breath caught. Neither of us moved for what felt like forever. And in that suspended moment, I knew something irrevocable had begun, something that would destroy us both, but neither of us could stop it. He looked at me then, his voice barely above a whisper. Careful, Lena, he said. You don't know what it means to be close to a man like me. I wanted to pull away, to tell him I didn't care, but my voice betrayed me, soft and trembling. Then show me. His gaze darkened, his jaw tightening as if fighting something invisible, and when he finally spoke again, it was quieter, almost mournful. Don't ask for what you don't understand. He left after that, the door closing behind him, leaving me alone with the fire and the echo of his words. But as I stood there, my hand still tingling from his touch, I knew one thing for certain. The bargain we'd made had already changed. Because whatever this was between us, it wasn't protection anymore. It was temptation. And temptation always demands a price. Nights in that house became longer than they should have been, hours stretching like threads pulled too tight, unraveling slowly into something that felt like madness, something too quiet to be peace and too heavy to be silence, and sometimes I would lie awake listening to the distant echo of footsteps in the hall. Not heavy enough to belong to his guards, not soft enough to be imagined. And I would wonder if it was him. If Dante lingered outside my door as I did outside his thoughts. Trapped between wanting to be seen and praying I would not be. I had begun to learn the rhythms of the mansion. The way the servants avoided certain corridors after sunset. The way the guards never spoke above a murmur when his name was mentioned. The way the lights in his office stayed on long past midnight, glowing faintly through the cracks of the door like a secret only the dark was allowed to keep. The bargain had changed things between us, though neither of us dared to say it aloud. It lived in the spaces between our words, in the glances that lingered a heartbeat too long, in the quiet way he would sometimes stand beside me and say nothing. And in those moments, I wasn't sure if I was safer or closer to ruin. I tried to keep myself busy, searching through the boxes and files he let me see. Old photographs, ledgers, coded messages that smelled faintly of dust and betrayal. But the more I read, the more it felt like I was walking deeper into a labyrinth my father had built, and Dante was still trapped inside. Every record, every missing name, every faded photograph led back to the same ghost. Salvatore Moretti, the man who had once been my father, and was now nothing but the echo of a crime that refused to die. And the more I uncovered, the more I felt his presence, not Dante's, but my father's, everywhere. Sometimes in the scent of cigars lingering in a forgotten jacket hanging in the library, sometimes in the sound of Dante's voice when he said my name, low and deliberate, in a tone that made me think he wasn't speaking to me at all, but to a memory of the man who had betrayed him. It was one of those nights, a night soaked in rain and electricity, when curiosity won over fear. I told myself it was only to help, to search for clues, to keep my end of the bargain. But deep down I knew it was something else. I needed to know him. Not the version the world whispered about. Not the man the newspapers called the Devil of New York, but the man who haunted his own house like a restless spirit. The door to his office was unlocked. I stood there for a moment, hand trembling on the brass handle, before pushing it open. The air inside was warm and heavy, filled with the scent of leather, smoke, and whiskey. Papers covered the desk, maps, photographs, notes written in Dante's sharp handwriting, each line deliberate, controlled, like him. A single lamp burned low, casting soft light across the room, and for a moment I just stood there, my breath shallow, my heart unsteady. Then I saw them. Photographs, dozens of them, tucked neatly into a folder labeled with my father's name. But when I opened it, I froze. They weren't of him. They were of me. The earliest ones were grainy, taken from a distance, me at the café, unlocking the door, serving customers, walking home at dusk. But as I turned the pages, the images grew closer, clearer. Me inside my apartment, asleep, brushing my hair, looking out the window, unaware that someone was watching. My stomach twisted. My vision blurred with something between rage and disbelief. He had been watching me long before the night he walked into my cafe. I didn't hear the door open. Looking for something? His voice was low, unreadable, and when I turned, he was standing in the doorway, half in shadow, half in light, the faintest trace of weariness in his eyes, as if he had known this moment would come and dreaded it. "How long?" I whispered, my throat dry. "How long have you been following me?" He didn't move. "Long enough to keep you alive." I laughed, a sound that didn't belong to me, sharp and brittle. "That's your excuse? You were protecting me?" "I was." I held up one of the photos, my hands shaking. "This isn't protection. This is obsession." He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his voice soft but sharp enough to cut. "You don't understand what your father did, Lena. The night he disappeared, he left a trail of bodies behind him. Everyone connected to him was marked, including you. I watched you because I knew they would find you eventually, and they did. My anger faltered, replaced by something colder, something that crawled up the back of my neck. So all of this, the cafe, the coffee, the gunfire, it wasn't a coincidence. No, he said, and there was no apology in his tone, only truth. It was inevitable. I turned away, pacing, my mind spinning. You should have told me. You wouldn't have believed me. You think I believe you now? He sighed, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked almost human, tired, maybe even sorry. I didn't want to frighten you. Too late, I said. But the words trembled, softer than I meant them to be. He came closer, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth of his breath against my temple. You think I wanted this? He murmured. You think I enjoy knowing where you are, who you talk to when you sleep? I didn't. But every time I thought about walking away, I remembered what happened to the last person who carried your father's bloodline. Something in his voice made me freeze. What do you mean? He hesitated, then exhaled, his jaw tightening. He had another child, a son, younger than you. They found him before I did. My heart stuttered. My brother? His silence was answer enough. I turned toward him, searching his face for something. Anger, pity, truth. But all I saw was grief buried beneath layers of control. You should have told me, I said again, my voice breaking. He nodded once, slow, almost imperceptible. I know. The air between us changed after that. Thicker, heavier, charged with too many unspoken things. He reached out, as if to touch my arm, but stopped just before his fingers met my skin. You shouldn't have come in here, he said quietly, though there was no threat in his tone. I had to know, I whispered. I know. We stood like that for what felt like hours, him, still as stone, me, trembling and breathless, surrounded by the evidence of a truth I wasn't ready to face. Then he turned away, his voice low, almost tender. You're not my prisoner anymore, Lena. You're my responsibility, whether you like it or not. And there was something in his words that scared me more than his gun, more than his secrets. Because it wasn't cruelty I heard this time. It was devotion. The kind that could destroy everything it touched. He walked past me, pausing at the door. Get some rest, he said without looking back. Tomorrow we start again. When he was gone, I stood there in the dim light, surrounded by photographs of my own face, by ghosts I didn't know I had, by the lingering scent of him. Smoke, rain, and something warm that shouldn't have comforted me but did. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the confusion, the anger, the grief, I realized the truth I didn't want to admit. He might have been watching me all along, but I had started watching him too. And that I knew was the most dangerous part of all. The night began like a wound reopening. Quiet at first, almost deceptively calm. The air heavy and slow. The kind of silence that carries weight. The kind that presses against your chest and makes you feel as though the world itself is holding its breath. I had been lying awake again, the moonlight spilling across the floor in long silver ribbons, my mind replaying everything I had learned, everything Dante had told me and everything he hadn't. Each memory a thread pulling tighter around me until I couldn't tell where fear ended and fascination began. I had started to dream about him, though I would never admit it aloud. Dreams that bled into waking thoughts, his voice in the dark, his touch imagined but vivid enough to make me tremble. I hated myself for it. Hated the way he had taken root inside me like something I couldn't excise. Hated that even as I questioned his every motive. Some fragile, foolish part of me wanted to believe there was more beneath the violence, that maybe the man I saw in those rare, unguarded moments was real. It was close to midnight when I heard it. The sound that didn't belong. Not footsteps this time, but something sharper, something that sliced through the quiet like a blade. A muffled crash downstairs, a voice, too harsh, too unfamiliar. Then another. I was already moving before I realized it, my body reacting faster than my thoughts, bare feet cold against the floor as I slipped into the hallway. The mansion that always felt too vast suddenly felt small, suffocating, the corridors pressing in as distant shouts echoed through them. "Lena!" His voice, low, commanding, unmistakable, cut through the chaos like thunder. He was somewhere below, and though instinct should have sent me back to my room, I found myself moving toward him instead. Down the staircase, heart hammering, breath shallow. I reached the edge of the foyer just as the front doors burst open, the night pouring in like ink, and in that fractured moment of light and movement I saw them. Dark figures, armed, faces hidden behind masks, shouting orders I couldn't make out. Then Dante, already there, already in motion. A ghost made of precision and rage, gun in hand, moving with that terrible grace I had seen glimpses of, but never understood until now. The first shot shattered the silence, a deafening crack that tore through the air and sent glass raining from the chandelier. I dropped behind the marble railing instinctively, covering my head, my breath coming fast and uneven as gunfire erupted, echoing through the house like a storm. I could hear Dante shouting commands, his voice cutting through the noise, steady, unshaken. And though fear burned in my throat, there was something else too. Awe, maybe, or disbelief, at the way he stood between danger and me, as if it were instinct, as if my life had somehow become his to protect. The fight didn't last long, but it felt endless. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. And when the last shot rang out, the silence that followed was worse, thick and heavy and filled with the smell of smoke and blood and the metallic tang of fear. "Dante?" I whispered, but the sound of my own voice startled me, too small in the aftermath of violence. I rose slowly, my hands shaking, my legs unsteady, and that's when I saw him, half kneeling against the far wall, his shirt torn, his arm pressed tight against his side, blood seeping between his fingers. I was at his side before I could think, dropping to my knees beside him. "You're hurt," I said, though the words were obvious, stupid, useless. He looked at me, and even then, even bleeding, he managed that faint, crooked smirk that always made me feel like he saw straight through me. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," I snapped, pressing my hands against the wound despite the tremor in them. The warmth of his blood soaked through my fingers, hot and slick, grounding and horrifying all at once. "You need help." His breath hitched as I pressed harder, his eyes closing briefly, and when he spoke again his voice was softer, roughened by pain but still steady. "You should have stayed upstairs." "I wasn't going to hide while you—" "While I what?" he interrupted, opening his eyes again, the intensity in them undimmed. "Get myself killed for you?" The words hit like a slap, sharp and heavy, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he exhaled, the fight in him fading as exhaustion settled over his features. "I told you not to trust me," he murmured. "And yet you're bleeding because of me," I said quietly, my voice breaking. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. "Maybe I deserved it." I shook my head, refusing to let go. "Stop talking like that." He caught my wrist suddenly, his grip firm despite his weakness, his eyes locking on mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "You don't know what I've done, Lena," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You think you see something in me worth saving, but you don't understand. I've burned entire lives to protect this empire. I've done things that would make you flinch if I spoke them aloud." "Then tell me," I whispered, leaning closer, unable to look away. "Tell me what you've done. Let me decide." His expression shifted. Something raw flickering beneath the hard surface. Something almost like fear. You shouldn't want to know, he said, and I shouldn't want to tell you. Outside, thunder rolled, deep and distant, and the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, rain lashing against the shattered windows, as if the sky itself had decided to confess. I helped him to his feet, one arm around his waist, his weight heavy but steady, his breath warm against my neck. We moved through the wreckage of the foyer, past the fallen men, the broken glass, the shattered chandelier that still glimmered faintly in the flashes of lightning. By the time we reached the library, he was trembling, pale, sweat beading his forehead, and I guided him onto the couch, my hands shaking as I searched for something, anything, to stop the bleeding. He watched me the entire time, his gaze unflinching, as if trying to memorize every movement, as if afraid I might vanish if he blinked. When I finally tied the makeshift bandage tight, he exhaled, a sound caught between pain and relief. You shouldn't be here, he said again, softer this time, almost pleading. And yet here I am, I said, sitting beside him, too tired to move, too full of everything I couldn't name. The fire had burned low, the light flickering over his face, carving him in gold and shadow, and in that dim glow he didn't look like a monster or a savior, just a man. Broken, bleeding, dangerous, yes, but also human. I didn't remember leaning in. Maybe it was instinct, maybe madness, but when my hand brushed his cheek, he didn't pull away. His skin was warm, rough beneath my fingertips, and when he looked at me, his eyes softened, the kind of softness that hurts because it's rare, because it feels like a secret. You don't fall in love with men like me, he said quietly, his breath catching as I leaned closer. We ruin what we touch. Then ruin me, I whispered. The words were reckless, foolish, true. He froze, for a heartbeat, for an eternity. And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. Fierce. The kind of kiss that consumes rather than comforts, that feels like a confession made without words. I tasted blood and rain and something darker. Something like surrender. And when he pulled away, his forehead resting against mine, his breath unsteady, he whispered the words that would haunt me long after that night. You have no idea what you've started. Outside, the storm raged on, drowning the world in thunder, and I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same again. Because for the first time, I wasn't afraid of Dante Romano. I was afraid of myself. Morning came like an apology that didn't mean it, gray and heavy and full of rain, the kind that clings to the windows and makes everything outside look like a dream trying to dissolve. And I remember sitting there in the half-light of dawn, watching the thin lines of water trail down the glass, and wondering when exactly I had stopped being afraid of him, and started being afraid of what would happen if he was no longer there. Dante slept on the couch beside the dying fire, his shirt stained with dried blood, his breathing shallow but steady, one hand resting against his ribs where I had bandaged him hours earlier. There was something disarming about him like this, stripped of all that armor and menace, his face soft in sleep, almost peaceful, though even then, even unconscious, he looked like a man who didn't quite know how to let go. I wanted to reach out, to touch him again, to trace the line of his jaw where the night's violence had left a shadow of exhaustion. But I didn't. I couldn't. The air between us still carried the weight of what we had done, what we had become. Two people bound by blood, by secrets, by something neither of us could name without breaking it. When he finally stirred, the fire had burned to ash, and the light outside had grown brighter, sharper, merciless. His eyes opened slowly, hazel and dark at the same time, and for a moment he looked disoriented, like a man waking in a world that no longer obeyed the rules he remembered. You should rest, I said softly, and he turned his gaze toward me. A faint, tired smile ghosting across his lips. "I don't rest," he murmured, voice rough, still half dreaming. "Men like me don't have that luxury." "You're bleeding through your shirt," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice betrayed me, too tender. His smile deepened by a fraction. "You worry too much. Maybe you don't worry enough." He sat up slowly, wincing, and I moved instinctively to steady him, my hands hovering near his arm, but never quite touching, afraid that the smallest connection might undo me again. "You should see a doctor," I whispered, but he shook his head. "No hospitals, too many questions, too many eyes." Of course. The world he lived in didn't allow weakness. It swallowed it. I watched him stand, the quiet strength in his movements returning, and something inside me twisted with both admiration and anger. Admiration because he was still standing after everything, and anger because he shouldn't have had to. Because the life he had built was a cage made of control and violence that wouldn't let him breathe. He caught me staring. "What?" I shook my head. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. The rest of the day passed in uneasy stillness. The house felt heavier somehow, the men quieter, the walls listening. There was a tension that hadn't been there before, a sense that something was moving beneath the surface, unseen but inevitable. It was late afternoon when one of his guards, Marco, a man with eyes like flint and hands that looked too used to holding weapons, came into the library. He leaned close to Dante, whispering something too low for me to hear. But whatever it was, I saw it in Dante's face immediately. His jaw tightened, his expression turning to stone. When Marco left, Dante didn't look at me right away. He just stood there, still and silent, before finally saying, "We found him." It took me a moment to understand. "Found who?" "Your father." The words felt impossible. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I thought of 100 things at once. His laugh, his debts, the way he used to smell like tobacco and engine oil, the way he left one night with nothing but a suitcase, and the promise that he'd come back. He never did. "Where?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Dante looked at me then, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw regret flicker behind the control. "He reached out," he said finally. "He wants to meet." I felt the world tilt, the floor drop out from beneath me. "He what?" "He made contact," Dante continued, his tone measured but his eyes darker than ever. "He says he can give me what he took, the ledger, the money, the names. He wants to trade." "For what?" I whispered, even though I already knew the answer. Dante hesitated, just long enough to make it hurt. "For you." The air left my lungs. "No." He stepped forward, his hand reaching for mine, but I pulled back, the sound of my pulse loud in my ears. "You're not serious. You wouldn't—" I told him no, he said quickly, his voice sharp, cutting through my panic. "I told him if he wants to deal, he faces me himself." But the damage was already done. The thought had been planted, the horror of it rooted deep. My father had sold me once already, not for money, but for safety, for escape. And now, all these years later, he was doing it again. "Lena," Dante said quietly, stepping closer. "Look at me." I couldn't. "Lena." His voice softened, and against my will I met his gaze. "He's not the man you remember," he said. "Whatever he was, he isn't anymore. He's desperate, dangerous." "And you're not?" I shot back, my anger cracking through the fear. He didn't flinch. "The difference is, I won't lie to you about what I am." We stood there, the storm between us thick and electric, neither of us moving. Finally, I broke first. "Let me talk to him," I said. "If he wants me, I can make him stop." "Absolutely not." "Dante—" He cut me off, his tone sharp now, commanding. "You don't go near him. You don't even breathe the same air he does, until I say it's safe." Something inside me snapped. You don't get to decide that for me. I do, he said, and though his voice was calm, it was the calm of thunder held just before it breaks. Because he'll kill you, Lena, or worse, he'll use you, and I won't let that happen. I wanted to argue, to scream, to tell him that this wasn't his choice, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Not anger, not control, but something deeper, something raw and unguarded. Fear. He was afraid for me. He didn't say it, but I saw it in the way his hand shook slightly when he ran it through his hair, in the way he turned away as if he couldn't stand to look at me and still stay composed. Please, he said finally, his voice breaking on the word. Don't make me choose between what I owe and what I can't lose. It was the first time I'd ever heard him sound unsure, and that was the moment I knew I would disobey him. That night, after he left to meet with his men, I found the phone in the office, the one he used for his private calls. My hands trembled as I dialed the number written on the small, folded paper I'd found earlier that day, tucked into the edge of one of my father's old photos, a number I told myself I would never use. The line clicked. Silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 10 years. Rougher now, older, but still my father's. Lena? My breath caught. Papa. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, tired, distant. You shouldn't be there, Piccolina. You're in danger. So are you, I said, my voice shaking. What did you do? Everything I had to, he whispered, and now I have to finish it. Before I could respond, the line went dead. And as I stood there in the silence that followed, the weight of everything pressing down on me, I knew what I had to do. The thing that would change everything. The thing that would either save us or destroy us. I was going to find him. With or without Dante. There is a particular kind of silence that exists before a storm. The kind that doesn't belong to weather but to fate itself. The kind that sits heavy in your lungs and tastes like guilt and inevitability. And as I stood in the hallway of Dante's mansion, my hand still trembling from the weight of the phone I had just dropped onto the desk, I realized that silence had already found me. The echo of my father's voice lingered in the air like smoke. Distant, fragile, haunting. And even though it had lasted barely a minute, it was enough to unmake the fragile sense of safety I had been clinging to since the night Dante first dragged me from the café. For 10 years I had dreamed of hearing that voice again, imagined 1,000 different versions of what I would say to him, what he would say to me, how I would ask him why he left and how he would make it right. But in the end, all he had given me was a warning wrapped in regret, and the terrible, suffocating knowledge that something was coming for us both. I should have told Dante. I should have run to him the moment the call ended, confessed everything, begged him to help me make sense of the things I didn't understand. But the truth was, I didn't trust what he would do with that information, didn't trust his need for vengeance not to swallow everything else, didn't trust myself not to let him talk me out of what I knew I had to do. So I left. I don't even remember the exact moment I decided, only the sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears as I slipped down the back stairs, the dim light catching the edges of framed portraits that seemed to watch me go, the quiet hum of the city beyond the iron gates. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled of it, sharp and clean and temporary, as though it were trying to wash away all the things that couldn't be undone. Marco had left a car idling near the side entrance, its keys still in the ignition. I didn't think, didn't breathe. I just drove. The city looked different at dawn, both more alive and more hollow, like a body that hadn't realized it was dying yet. I followed the directions my father had once taught me as a girl, the kind that weren't written down, but lived in muscle memory. The old streets of the industrial district, the bridge that bent like a spine over the river, the warehouse that had once belonged to men whose names no one spoke out loud. When I finally saw him, He didn't look like the man I remembered. He was thinner, older, his hair more gray than dark, his hands trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette he didn't seem to want. He looked up when I stepped out of the car, and for a heartbeat I saw the ghost of recognition flicker in his eyes. Then guilt swallowed it whole. "Lena," he said, my name breaking in his throat like a confession. "You shouldn't have come." I wanted to say 100 things, to scream, to demand, to cry, but all that came out was a whisper. "Why?" He exhaled smoke and sorrow. "Because the moment you stepped back into my life, they stopped aiming for me." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to find reason in the madness that had consumed everything since that night in the cafe. "Dante said you stole from him, that you betrayed him." A bitter laugh escaped him, dry and hollow. "Betrayed him?" "I saved him, Lena. I took what I took because I had to. Because if I hadn't, he'd be dead." The words hit like a blow. "You're lying." "I wish I were," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, broken, made something inside me falter. There was a coup inside the Romano family. Someone was selling him out, feeding information to his enemies. I found out who it was. I took the money, the names, everything that could be used against him, and I disappeared. I thought I was saving his life and mine and yours, but he never saw it that way. He only saw the theft. I could barely breathe. "Then who—" He cut me off, his eyes shifting toward the door of the warehouse. "We don't have time for that." "Who betrayed him?" I demanded. "The man standing behind you," he said. I spun around, and there he was, Dante. He looked like a storm given flesh, his jaw set, his eyes burning, his coat still slick with rain. For a moment I thought the sight of me might soften him, might stop what I saw building behind his gaze. But it didn't. It only made it worse. "Lena," he said, his voice low, measured, like someone holding on to the last thread of control. "You shouldn't be here." "So everyone keeps telling me," I said, though the words came out weaker than I intended. He stepped forward, his eyes flicking toward my father. "You called her, didn't you?" My father didn't answer. "You brought her here," Dante said, his tone sharper now, the calm breaking. "You wanted her in the middle of this." "Don't talk about her like she's a weapon," my father snapped. "That's what you made her," Dante shot back. "You've been using her since the day she was born." "Enough!" I shouted, the sound raw in my throat. But neither of them looked at me. Two men bound by the same ghost, circling each other like predators that had forgotten they shared the same wound. Dante moved first. He reached into his coat, and my heart stopped because I knew that gesture, knew what it meant, knew the violence that lived in his hands. But before he could draw, my father raised his own gun, old and shaking but steady enough. "Put it down," my father said. "You don't want to do this." "You think you know what I want?" Dante said, his voice like ice cracking. "You think I haven't spent every day of the last 10 years wanting to forget the night your lies cost me my brother?" Something inside me broke. "Stop," I said, stepping between them before I could think better of it. "Just stop. Both of you." Dante's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing toward me. "Get out of the way, Lena." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "Not until you tell me the truth. All of it." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel both of them breathing. My father behind me, Dante in front, the air between us charged, waiting to break. It was my father who spoke first. "He doesn't want the truth, Piccolina. He wants revenge." Dante's expression shifted, something flickering there, something I couldn't name. And in that moment I realized he wasn't going to shoot my father, but someone else did. The shot came from outside, sharp, deafening, final. And before I could even process it, my father staggered backward, the gun falling from his hand, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked like sorrow. I caught him as he fell, my knees hitting the cold concrete, the smell of blood filling the air. "Papa," I whispered, my hands pressed against the wound, warm and useless. "Stay with me, please." He looked up at me, his voice barely a breath. "Not him," he whispered. "It was never him. It was—" But the rest never came. He went still in my arms, his eyes open but empty, and the sound that tore from my throat didn't feel human. Dante was beside me in an instant, his hands on my shoulders trying to pull me back, but I fought him, sobbing, cursing, hitting his chest until my strength gave out. He held me through it, silent, his own breath uneven, and when I finally looked up at him, the rage and grief in his eyes mirrored mine. Outside, footsteps echoed, more of them, closing in fast. "They found us," he said, pulling me to my feet, his voice rough. "We have to go now." I looked down at my father one last time, my heart shattering around the word that would never be spoken, and as Dante dragged me toward the exit, I knew that whatever came next would destroy whatever fragile piece of me still belonged to the girl I used to be. Because my father's last words weren't just a warning. They were a promise. And whoever had fired that shot was still out there, waiting. Time doesn't move the same way after death. It doesn't flow. It lingers. It hangs in the air like smoke after a gunshot, heavy and unyielding, refusing to fade until you've breathed every last piece of it into your lungs and learned to live with the taste. The days after my father's death came and went like ghosts, shapeless and cruel, and I moved through them as though I was half asleep, half alive. A body without gravity, a heart without a rhythm that belonged to anything but grief. The world outside kept spinning. The rain fell, the streets filled, people laughed somewhere far away. But inside Dante's mansion, time had stopped. He buried my father quietly, without ceremony, somewhere on the outskirts of the city where the earth was soft and unmarked. He didn't tell me where, and I didn't ask, because some part of me knew that I couldn't stand to see it. Couldn't bear to watch the last piece of a man who had shaped both my pain and my love for survival disappear beneath the ground. I stayed in my room for 3 days, maybe 4, the hours folding in on themselves until all I could feel was the echo of that gunshot, the way it had split my life cleanly in two, before and after, light and dark, truth and everything that came to destroy it. Dante didn't come to me at first. I think he knew I needed the silence more than I needed his words, and maybe he needed it too. There was a change in the air after that night, something subtle but unshakable. The house no longer hummed with the same tension. The men spoke softer. The lights burned lower. And the man who had once filled every room with his presence seemed to disappear into the shadows he had spent his whole life trying to control. It was on the 5th night, when the storm finally broke, that I found him. He was in his office, the same place where I had once found those photographs of myself, though now the desk was empty. The papers gone. The shelves stripped bare. The firelight painted his face in amber and shadow, and for a long moment I just stood there in the doorway, watching him. This man who had once terrified me, saved me, ruined me, and somehow, in all that chaos, taught me what it meant to be seen even in my fear. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, though there was no edge to the words, no command, only weariness. "Neither should you," I replied, stepping into the room. His eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time since that night, I saw something raw and human there. Not the cold precision of a man who controlled everything, but the quiet devastation of someone who had finally realized that control couldn't save him from loss. "He wasn't supposed to die," he said, his voice breaking slightly, a confession dressed as regret. "He was supposed to tell me the truth." I took a step closer. "He did," I said softly. "You just didn't want to believe it." Dante's gaze dropped, his hands tightening on the edge of the desk. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to spend 10 years chasing a ghost, hating a man who might have been my only friend? No, I said, my voice trembling. I think you didn't know how to stop. He exhaled slowly, his eyes closing. It was my consigliere, he said after a long silence. The betrayal. The leak. It was him all along. Your father tried to warn me. I already knew. I had seen the name in one of the files he'd shown me before. A name that now felt meaningless because it had cost too much to matter. Then it's over, I whispered. It's done. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable, the firelight catching in his eyes. You think it's that easy? That I can walk away from all of this? From the blood that built it? Yes, I said, because I already did. He smiled, a sad, hollow thing that didn't reach his eyes. You were never part of this world, Lena. You just fell into it because of me. No, I said, stepping closer until I was standing in front of him. Because of my father. Because of what he did. But you kept me here. You could have let me go, you didn't. His silence said more than any apology could. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and touched his cheek. The same place I had once pressed my hand to when he was bleeding and angry and still trying to pretend he didn't care. He didn't move away this time. His skin was warm beneath my fingers, his breath steady but shallow. And when he finally looked at me again, I saw it. The thing that had always been there beneath the violence, beneath the power, beneath the name that made men tremble. He was just tired. I loved him once, he said quietly, almost to himself. Your father. Like a brother. And I loved you before I had the right to. The words caught in my throat. And now? He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hurts to look at. Now I don't know if I love you or if I just need you to forgive me. I felt tears sting my eyes before I could stop them. Maybe it's the same thing. He reached up then, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face, and for a moment the world stopped. The rain outside, the fire, the silence. Everything faded until there was only him, only us, standing in the wreckage of what we'd both done. He leaned in, slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid the air itself might shatter between us. And when his lips met mine, it wasn't like before. Not desperate or violent or filled with the need to forget. It was quiet. Fragile. An apology written in touch instead of words. When he pulled away, he whispered against my skin, "You should go." I shook my head. "And you?" "I can't," he said. "This is all I've ever known. But you can still have a life that doesn't end in blood." I wanted to argue, to tell him that it was already too late, that the moment he walked into my cafe and said one last coffee, he had rewritten the course of my life so completely that there was no before and after anymore. Only him, only this. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. So I left. I don't remember the drive back to the city. Only the rain and the silence and the way my heart felt like it was splitting open and healing all at once. I reopened the cafe a week later. New glass, new paint. Same walls. As if normal could be rebuilt with enough effort. People came and went, ordered their drinks, laughed, lived, and I learned to smile again, or at least to pretend well enough that no one looked too closely. But every night, after closing, I would sit at the same table where he had once sat. The table by the window, where the light caught the edges of the glass. And I would pour one last cup of coffee, set it across from me, and let the steam curl into the air like a memory I couldn't bury. Sometimes I imagined he would walk through that door again. Tall, quiet, dangerous in that unassuming way that made the world hold its breath. And say it the same way he did that night. One last coffee. And sometimes, in the silence that followed, I would swear I could hear his voice, soft and low, carried in the hum of the city outside. Maybe he's still out there. Maybe he's watching from afar, keeping his promise the only way he knows how. With distance, with shadows, with the kind of love that burns quietly instead of bright. Or maybe he's gone, and all that's left of us is this. A story steeped in smoke and blood and memory, 2 lives tangled by fate. A girl who fell for the devil and a devil who tried, for one brief, impossible moment, to be human. But, every night, as I close the cafe and turn the sign to closed, I glance at the door, just once, and whisper into the quiet, just one last coffee. And somehow, even in the emptiness that follows, it feels like he hears me.